Welcome to Hiking with Anderson. I'm Dr. Owen Anderson, and I'm the Research Director at Clarity Fund. And this is Season 2, Episode 5. We've been talking this season about the idea of foundational beliefs. We're taking this from the Apostle Paul, especially in Hebrews 6, that there are certain beliefs we should have in place in order to go on to maturity. We can also liken that to the idea of a rock, building your house on a rock, so that when the storms and trials of life come, you're not blown away and overcome. And in subsequent episodes, we looked at some of the major excuses that people bring up for rejecting the idea of God, excuses that come up in the history of philosophy, the history of thought, or alternative beliefs that set themselves up in contrast to the knowledge of God. So we looked at some of those in order to continue the theme that it's clear to reason that God is eternal, only God is eternal, and that the unbelief is without excuse. The last episode, though, we were looking at devotions. We were out in the desert in the morning, and especially thinking about the role of Psalms in Christian devotions. And I'm still kind of thinking along those lines this time in a way that somewhat combines those two themes in this sense. I was thinking about discontentment and the way that the world seems to be structured in an unfair manner. And people complain and grumble, and they say it's not right. And that's a kind of reality we have to face. The world seems to be set up in a way that strikes us initially as unfair, right? The wicked prosper, and the righteous are suffering. And we might complain about that and say, if the world had been organized by a perfectly good and powerful God, then it wouldn't look this way. So it's part of the problem of evil. But you can see how people arrive at that conclusion as they look around and they see that things don't seem to be set up well, right? Some people are privileged in the sense that maybe their uncle is the director and so they get a lucrative movie job, or they're related to the CEO and so they get a nice position in the business. And those kind of things continue. And someone else who's working hard might not get ahead at all. And then they begin to say, well, why should I work hard? I don't get anything out of it. And so you begin to wonder, what's the purpose of these things? In contrast, we want to set up a meritocracy where people are rewarded for hard work and talent and not merely for who they're related to. But then there are ways you can tweak with the meritocracy, right? Especially by having better access to childhood education, a better upbringing. They can pay for you to develop your talents and have discipline so that you can then get into the best schools and get the best jobs. And so even then when people say, I got ahead by my hard work, you see ways in which it doesn't seem to be structured fairly. And so you understand that people might complain about that, and it raises that problem of evil, really. The 18th century philosopher David Hume used this as an example. He said, imagine if someone told you they were a great architect, and they took you to a house that they'd built, and all the floors were uneven, and the doors were crooked, and the windows were not straight. You would say to them, you're not a good architect at all. What are you talking about? Look at your house. It's not well structured. It's not ordered. And if they began to give excuses, right, they might say, well, it looks good to me. And you say, oh, look, the floors are not straight. And they say, well, I had to make the floors that way because the doors are crooked. And you say, well, right, the doors are crooked, right? So why are the doors crooked? Well, the windows weren't quite right. So I had to match the doors to the windows. And you begin to see, well, this is all circular. Each thing is used to justify the next. And overall, if you were a good architect, none of these things would be problematic. And so we would conclude that the house is not designed by a brilliant architect. And so when we look at the world by analogy, and we say, well, the world is so disorganized that it doesn't seem to be the outcome of a wise architect at all. Or what David Hume suggested maybe is that it was the outcome of an infant deity, one of the first attempts of the deity, who's then gone on to make others. So this is an attack at the knowledge of God, right? This is saying we have an excuse for not believing God is perfectly wise. And it hits us at that existential level, right? So it's not just sort of abstract thinking about, is God wise, but it hits us at the level of our lives. We look at our lives and they don't seem to be fair. It reminds me of the psalmist in Psalm 73. Asaph is troubled by some of these same things. He says he's looking and he sees the proud and the wicked and they're prospering. They're doing very well for themselves. They have money and privilege, prestige. They get ahead. They can persecute and mock others. And he didn't think that was fair. But then he begins to consider his own condition. It says he realized that he'd been as a beast before God. He'd been only looking at these outward things, and not thinking about what is eternal. So it says he went to the sanctuary of God. So that's not merely just going to some building where you might meditate or pray. This is very specific. The sanctuary of God outlines the redemptive plan of God, right? So as you approach the sanctuary, you see the altar for sacrifice. The reality is that because of our condition in sin, we need atonement, atoning sacrifice. And so he begins to consider those things, and he begins to consider their condition before God. Really, that they are only concerned about these outward things. They're not lasting. So he says that. They're on a slippery slope. And I don't think it merely means that the stock market might suddenly crash and they lose everything. Although that does happen to some people. That doesn't always happen. I think it's especially the idea about what is eternal. They have absolutely no understanding about that. So any of these outward things that one is jealous about and provoked about, that's a misplaced envy. Because in fact, you should feel sorry for such persons who are only concerned about the bodily needs. They have no understanding about what is eternal and eternal needs. This is how the preacher said it in Ecclesiastes. He said, God has put eternity in our hearts. So we have this recognition that there must be something eternal, and we strive after that. And so when we look and we see persons who are completely satisfying themselves with merely temporary pleasures, that should not be a source of discontentment. Even if they're using their power and prestige and privilege in ways that it might provoke us to jealousy, we should be able to say, no, that we have eternity in our hearts. If they don't know what's eternal, then that's sorrowful. And that's really what all discontent boils down to, is a misplaced understanding of the good. If we understood what is good, what is our highest good, we would have no room for being discontent. Our highest good can't be taken from us. That's why we've talked about it here and at Clarity Fund as knowledge. Knowledge can't be taken from you. You can lose your material possessions or relationships, but they can't come in and take your knowledge. And it's not just knowledge of anything, but especially knowledge of the highest good. What is eternal? The highest being. What is eternal? That's knowledge that can't change. So knowing God is the highest good, and that's not something you can get because your uncle is a director or your relative is the CEO. You only get the highest good by seeking it yourself. And your outward condition doesn't often reflect it. In fact, it might be an inverse relation, which is kind of what Asaph discovers, and part of what we talked about last time in terms of the dryness of the desert motivating you to seek after God. So we should expect that in life. And when we see the wicked persecuting, we should expect that kind of thing. That's one of the things that is mentioned in the Beatitudes. You should expect and be happy if you're persecuted, because that's what they did to Christ. So what is there that could take us away from the good? It doesn't seem to be anything. In fact, if we're seeking the good, it seems that all things work together for the good, and that any of these things that we might begin to want to grumble about, we might initially complain about, are really things that motivate us to seek the good and can be sources of knowing the good. If we keep that in place, keep that in mind, it's clear what is good. So the main concern then is not to look and see, oh, someone else has a thing that I didn't get, and it's unfair because they got it without the right kind of work or effort. Those things are there, but the question is, do I know what is good? Do they know what is good? And that's what Asaph concludes. He says he comes to realize that God holds him by his right hand. Now, what good could be better than that? Of all the things that he lists when he's considering the rich and the wicked, none of them would be comparable to that. So in thinking about the good, the highest good, and discontentment, we see we don't really have any reason to grumble and complain if we're pursuing the good. And we need to know what is good. And that's one of the reasons why we spend time at Clarity Fund talking about skepticism and fideism, the belief that knowledge is not possible. We can't even have the good because we can't know anything. Or fideism agrees that we can't know, but we should just believe. And part of the reason that we talk about those is precisely because those say there is an excuse for not knowing God, and therefore that there is an excuse for not having what is good. We want to work on seeing how, no, there is no excuse. We should know God, and we can get into discussions then, and we have already about what that means to know. So the highest good is knowing God, and that can't be taken from us. Even out in the desert, where it seems so dry and desolate in one sense, it might actually be a great motivating factor for seeking the good, because as you're out here, it might provoke you to begin to think about philosophical questions, which are then sources of conversations that we get to have like this. So thanks for joining me on a hike in the desert as we talk about the good.